16. The bigger picture. My husband. I've not mentioned my husband at all, have I? I married at 19, which was far too young, and, if I'm being perfectly honest, was a total mistake. Looking back, I think I married to get away from home. It was the early 70s, and living together was not as widely accepted as it is now. I knew my dad would never approve. My mum had died a couple of years earlier at the age of 46, and I was devastated. I had already met Dennis then, my husband, and at the time when I lost Mum, I turned to him more and more to help me through a difficult period. When he asked me to marry him, I saw no reason not to. Dad had started seeing someone else, and although I liked her very much, she was not my mum, and I wasn't too happy with her being in my mum's home. Selfish, I know. I wanted Dad to be happy, and so the easiest thing was for me to marry and move out of the family home. Dennis and I were married in June 1973 and moved into a flat not too far from my dad and the rest of the family. Life was pretty good to start with, although it was never the mad, passionate love you should have when you first marry. However, we poodled along together and rode some of the storms of life. 9 years on, and I became pregnant with our first child, but sadly lost him in late pregnancy. I was devastated, but a couple of years later, I was pregnant again, and this time gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy, Jordan. I loved being at home with my new baby, but we couldn't afford for me to stay there permanently, so I went back to work. It was a few years later that I changed jobs. Dennis liked to remain very much within his comfort zone, which was basically work and home. He was not a social creature at all, whereas I was just the opposite. I loved people and I loved to party. His idea was going out, was going over to his mum's for a cup of tea. Dennis came to a few social events with me, but it was blatantly clear that he hated every moment of it. He would sit with his face on, and eventually it was just easier to give up and go home. He also hated me going out with Junie or any other friends. I remember one night just before Christmas, June and I had started an evening hairdressing course. Another one of our mad but fun things to do. It was fun, to be honest, because we laughed our way through the whole 6 weeks of it. On the last night, everyone went to the pub for a drink, and as June and I had got a lift with someone else that night, we had no choice but to go too. I'm not making excuses here. We both wanted to go very much. We didn't stay long, just about an hour. Just a couple of drinks, but in that hour, Dennis and June's husband, also called Dennis, had decided we'd gone missing. Something terrible must have happened to us, and so they called the police. Not only did Dennis want me to remain within his comfort zone, he wanted me to remain with him. He had grown up in a home where both parents worked incredibly hard and didn't go out much at all. When his dad wasn't at work, he was tending his large garden and growing enough fruit and veg to feed his family. His mum not only had a full-time job, but she ran the home too. She had 3 sons and did everything for them. I think she was probably too exhausted to have a social life. Dennis wanted to continue with that lifestyle he had grown up with and expected me to fall into it too. I, on the other hand, was raised by parents who enjoyed the company of others and had a good social life. Growing up, I lived among extended family. My dad had 3 siblings, and his stepmom had around 5 children of her own. Nan lived 2 streets away from us, and I remember the numerous family parties at her house. Always a good old-fashioned knees up with her playing the piano, pints of beer swilling around on top, and everyone singing along. We lived upstairs in a large Victorian house with my aunt and her 2 grown-up boys living downstairs. It was never quiet, and my cousins never needed a reason for a party. Excuse me. My mum was a strong, independent woman who loved nothing more than having a good time. She taught me well. I should have known really from the beginning that our marriage was doomed, but we tried to make it work for 15 years. It all came to a head one evening with a massive row, and he ended up walking out and going back home to his mum. I think he expected me to run after him, full of apologies and promises that I would change. He expected me to beg him to come home. I didn't. I knew that if I ever wanted to live my own life in a way that I wanted to, then that was the time to make the break. I didn't want much from life. I just wanted to grow as a person, have fun, learn new things, and enjoy life in the best way I could. I would not be able to do that if Dennis and I stayed together. And so we separated. It wasn't particularly amicable. He obviously blamed me, and yes, I suppose I was at fault. I wanted to get out of the marriage, but he didn't. Someone was bound to get hurt. Jordan was around 4 or 5 at the time, and I felt guilty because his mum and dad no longer lived together. Everyone told me that it would be better for him to live with one parent rather than with a house full of hostility and fighting. I'm not sure. Guilt stayed with me for years, and if I'm honest, I still feel it today. I felt guilty because I'd hurt my husband. He wasn't a bad man, just not the man for me. And I felt guilty because I broke up Jordan's home. After a few months, it became clear that I couldn't cope financially. Dennis had managed to lose his job and wasn't giving me any money at all. I couldn't pay the mortgage plus all the bills and feed us on what I earned. I was at my wit's end and didn't know what to do. It seemed my only option was to go home to Dad and my stepmother, which was the last thing I wanted to do. It eventually got to the point where I'd reached rock bottom. Jordan was out playing with friends one day, and I was sitting on the bottom of the stairs crying my eyes out. Pat came round and announced that she'd come up with a possible solution. "It's only temporary," she said, "but why don't you and Jordan move in with us until you get back on your feet again?" She went on to say that they had the space and they would love having Jordan around. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to give up my home. What if living with Pat and Jeff didn't work? I would have nowhere to go. Again, she came up with the solution. Rent the house out, that would pay for the mortgage and cover the bills, but you would always have somewhere to go back to if it didn't work out. So that's what we ended up doing. Now, I'm a great believer that the universe conspires to get you in the right place at the right time with the right people. I needed to change my job in order to meet Pat and Jeff. I needed my marriage to break up in order for Jordan and I to move in with Pat and Jeff. And I needed to be in that position for the rest of my life to change. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and at the time, I thought my life was doomed. Here's a quote from A.J. Leon. Knowing what you don't want is all you need to start the adventure of a lifetime.